I have spent 42 standard years breathing the recycled metallic tang of this observation post, watching the slow dissolution of worlds that once sang with the hum of billions. My skin has turned the color of old parchment, and my lungs rattle with the fine, grey ash of forgotten hive cities. Yet my eyes remain clear enough to document the cost of biological endurance. Survival in this galaxy is rarely a triumph. It is a prolonged, agonizing negotiation with the inevitable. A desperate clinging to a ledge that has already crumbled into the void. I have seen men sewn into the cold, unfeeling iron of heavy machinery to serve as living cogs until their minds fray into static. I have watched entire populations converted into nutrient slurry, their consciousness flickering out only when the final chemical vat dissolves their marrow. To live is to suffer, but to survive is to witness the true depth of our extinction. If you still walk beside me through fire and scripture, then bear witness. Subscribe, share this burden, and let others hear the truth buried beneath hymns. The first record I ever catalogued concerned the sinking of the bulk hauler Golgotha's Lament, a vessel that did not die in the void, but rather within the suffocating embrace of its own failing systems. It serves as a foundational lesson in the mathematics of misery that governs our existence. When the warp drive misaligned and the Gellar field flickered for a mere fraction of a second, the ship was not torn asunder by daemons. Instead, it was folded into a pocket of reality where time became a stagnant pool of oil. For the crew of 12,000, the catastrophe was not a sudden explosion, but a permanent transition into a state of biological stasis that allowed for the full sensation of cellular decay without the mercy of expiration. They remained conscious as their skin fused with the deck plating, their nervous systems rewiring into the ship's primary vox, arrays so that every creak of the hull was felt as a snapping of bone. I read the logs recovered 3 centuries later, transcribed from the screams still echoing in the ship's vox casters. They did not want rescue. They wanted the heat of a melter, charged to finally sever the connection between their souls and the weeping iron. This is the baseline of our reality, a universe where the laws of physics are frequently rewritten by the malice of the warp, leaving the human form as nothing more than a canvas for eternal, structural agony. We are told that the Emperor protects, and perhaps he does, but his protection often takes the form of a sword through the heart, rather than a shield against the dark. For those who fall outside his immediate light, the alternatives are far more creative in their cruelty. I remember a young girl from the hive world of Viridia Prime, a child of the mid-levels who thought the greatest danger in her life was the smog lung that claimed her father. She was wrong. During a localized cult uprising, she was taken not as a sacrifice, but as a vessel. The heretics did not kill her. They stitched her into a living tapestry of flesh, her lungs kept inflated by a rhythmic bellows made from the tanned hides of her own kin. She lived for 7 years in that state, a sensory conduit for a warp entity that fed on the specific frequency of her silent, internal screaming. When the Inquisition finally purged the spire, they found her. She was no longer recognizable as human, yet her eyes, the only part of her they had left untouched, so she could witness her own dissolution, track the movement of the stormtroopers with a terrifying, lucid intelligence. The medic who found her committed suicide 3 days later. He could not erase the sound of her heartbeat, which had been magically amplified to fill the entire chamber like the tolling of a catastrophic bell. That is the survival we do not speak of in the propaganda vids. We speak of the glorious dead, the martyrs who fall with a prayer on their lips and a bolter in their hand. We do not speak of the billions who are kept alive because their pain is a resource, a fuel for entities that find the brief spark of a quick death to be a wasteful extravagance. The Mechanicus, in their cold, logical pursuit of efficiency, provide another flavor of this enduring nightmare. On the Forge world of Lucius, there is a sector dedicated to the repurposing of those who have failed their quotas. These are not turned into the mindless servitors we see patrolling the palace corridors, whose lobotomies offer a hollowed-out peace. No, these are the awake servants. They are stripped of their limbs and replaced with hydraulic lifts and drilling teeth. But their cognitive centers are left entirely intact. They feel every spark of the welding torch, every grind of the rusted gears in their hips, and the constant, itching pressure of the binaric cant screaming through their auditory nerves. They are locked behind a firewall of their own flesh, unable to scream, unable to blink, forced to watch their own hands perform repetitive, soul-crushing tasks for centuries. I once spoke to a tech priest who oversaw such a line. He viewed their survival as a supreme act of devotion, a way for the weak to finally contribute something of value to the omnisia. To him, their suffering was merely friction in a grand machine, a secondary effect of a necessary process. He could not understand why I found the sight of 1,000 weeping, cybernetic eyes to be a sign of a failing civilization. He only saw the output numbers, in the deep underhives, where the light of the sun is a myth told to frighten children. Survival takes on a predatory, cannibalistic edge. There is a fungus that grows in the dampest, most toxic sumps of Necromunda, known to the locals as the Shiver. It does not kill its host. Instead, it replaces the calcium in the bones with a flexible, porous substance that allows the body to be folded and compressed into impossibly small spaces. I have seen men infected with the Shiver who have lived for decades inside the narrow ventilation ducts of the hive, their bodies elongated and pale, feeding on the vermin that scuttle through the dark. They lose the ability to speak, their vocal cords stretching into thin, useless wires. But they retain their memories of the world above. They watch through the grates as their former neighbors go about their lives, silent witnesses to a world they can no longer touch. They are the ultimate survivors, adapted perfectly to a world of filth and shadow. Yet they are ghosts in their own homes, trapped in a biological prison that refuses to let them die, even as their humanity rots away. Then there are the Drukhari. To mention them is to invite a chill that no thermal unit can displace. They have mastered the art of survival as a form of high art, though not for themselves, for their victims. Their homunculi possess technologies that can keep a head alive in a jar for millennia. The brain exposed to a constant stream of neurotoxins that simulate the feeling of being flayed alive every microsecond. I have seen reports of living furniture in the dark city of Komarag, where the aristocracy of that blighted place sits upon chairs made of still, beating hearts and sentient skin. These wretches are fed through tubes, their waste recycled back into their systems, ensuring that not a single drop of their agony is wasted. They survive because their torment is the only thing keeping their captors young. In the dark city, death is a luxury that must be earned, and few are ever wealthy enough to pay the price. They are kept in a state of perpetual, agonizing life, their souls stretched thin like gold leaf over a bottomless pit of despair. I think often of the crew of the Righteous Fury, a cruiser that was lost in a warp rift during the Gothic War. They were not destroyed, they were merely relocated. They found themselves in a region of space where the stars were black, and the vacuum was filled with a thick, suffocating mist that tasted of old copper. The ship's life support held for 300 years. Without a sun, without a destination, the crew descended into a state of ritualized existence. They began to eat the dead, then the weak, then the parts of themselves they no longer deemed necessary for the task of sitting in the dark. By the time the ship drifted back into Imperial space, there was only one man left. He was found in the bridge, fused to the command throne by his own filth and a strange, crystalline growth that had erupted from the ship's consoles. He was still alive, his heart beating once every 10 minutes. When the boarding party approached, he didn't ask for water or food. He only asked if the war was over. When they told him the war would never be over, he began to laugh, a sound that cracked his dry throat and sent shards of his own teeth spilling onto the floor. He died then, not because his body failed, but because the hope that had sustained his 3-century-long nightmare was revealed to be a lie. The ultimate horror of these stories is not the physical pain, though that is significant. It is the endurance of the mind. The human spirit is terrifyingly resilient. It can adapt to almost anything, including the unthinkable. We are built to last, to push through the red mist of pain and the grey fog of exhaustion. In any other universe, this would be a virtue. In the 41st millennium, it is our greatest curse. It means that when the monsters come, when the machines grind us down, when the warp twists our DNA into knots, we do not simply vanish, we linger. We become part of the landscape of horror, a living testimony to the fact that there are things far worse than the grave. I have seen the records. I have heard the vox thrum of the dying who cannot die. And I have felt the vibration of the great machinery that feeds on this collective misery. To survive is to remain on the battlefield long after the ammo has run out and the lights have gone dark, waiting for a blow that never comes, or worse, for a blow that hits but does not kill. The records of the administratum are littered with the dry, ink-stained obituaries of worlds, but few accounts carry the psychological weight of the siege of Vervin, Jew. It was not a battle of grand maneuvers or orbital bombardments that broke the spirit of that world, but the slow, methodical application of biological stagnation. The enemy did not use viral bombs to end life. They used a tailored mutagenic strain that accelerated the healing process to a grotesque degree. Men who were disemboweled in the trenches found their entrails knitting back together in seconds, trapping the filth and shrapnel of the battlefield inside their own abdominal cavities. Wounds did not scar, they grew new, redundant organs. Vestigial eyes that blinked from the meat of a thigh, or teeth that sprouted from the roof of a shattered skull. The soldiers of the PDF could not die. They were caught in a loop of perpetual trauma, where every bayonet thrust resulted in a hideous, lumpen overgrowth of repair. By the 8th month of the siege, the trenches were filled with mountains of screaming, tangled biomass that had once been companies of honorable men. They were still breathing, still conscious, their minds intact within a prison of runaway cellular growth that had turned them into a singular, pulsing carpet of sentient meat. I spoke with a survivor, a captain whose lower half had been fused into the mud of a trench by a carpet of his own regenerating skin. He told me that the worst part was not the pain, but the hunger. Their bodies were burning through calories at an impossible rate to fuel the mutations. Yet they had nothing to eat but the air and their own shed scales. He had been there for 3 years when the relief force arrived. They didn't rescue him. They used heavy flamers to cleanse the grid, and he thanked them as the promethium turned his world into a white, hot blur of merciful ending. This is the true nature of the darkest survival in our age. The refusal of the universe to let the spark of life go out when it has become a liability. Consider the fate of the navigators who are cast out from their houses. The so-called warp struck, when a navigator's third eye is corrupted by a direct gaze into the raw madness of the Imperium. They do not always perish. Sometimes, the warp anchors itself in their grey matter, turning their skull into a permanent window. They are kept in lead-lined oubliettes deep beneath the spires of holy terror, not out of mercy, but because their connection to the void acts as a localized beacon for psychic research. Their bodies become translucent, their bones visible through skin that has turned to the consistency of jellyfish membrane. They float in pressurized tanks of holy oils, their mouths open in a silent, eternal scream that vibrates the very glass of their containers. They survive for centuries in this state, their consciousness spread across the tides of the warp like salt in an ocean. They see every horror that has ever been or ever will be, their minds unable to filter the deluge of information. They are the ultimate witnesses, forced to survive because their misery provides a data point for the astropaths to calculate the shifting currents of the Great Rift. To them, Time is not a line, but a circle of fire, and they are the center point of the blaze. In the forge hives of Mars, there is a sub-sect of the priesthood that specializes in the preservation of the logical core. They believe that a human brain is too valuable a processor to be wasted on the transition to death. When a high-ranking magos suffers a catastrophic failure of their organic components, they are not always interred in a sarcophagus of honor. Some are subjected to the rite of the iron loom. Their brain is sliced into thousands of thin sections, each one preserved in a separate nutrient-fed slide and connected by a web of fiber-optic nerves. This lattice can fill a room the size of a cathedral. The magos remains alive, their consciousness distributed across a vast, humming architecture of glass and gold. They can think a million thoughts at once, but they can no longer feel the warmth of a hand or the taste of water. They become a ghost in a machine of their own making, their personality slowly eroded by the cold, binary logic of the system. I have walked through such a loom, hearing the faint, rhythmic clicking of the slides as the magos processed the logistics of a sub-sector's grain production. There was a flickering light in the center of the room, a visual representation of the subject's pulse. It was erratic, a frantic staccato that suggested the mind within was trying to find a way to stop the clock. But the machines would not let it. The pumps hissed, the nutrients flowed, and the magos continued to calculate the cost of a war they could no longer understand, surviving as a fragmented god of a very small, very cold world. The Xenos known as the Tyranids offer a survival that is perhaps the most total, and therefore the most terrifying. We speak of worlds being consumed, but we rarely dwell on the mechanics of that consumption. When the shadow in the warp descends, the atmosphere is thickened with spores that begin to break down the host's respiratory system while they are still standing. But the hive mind is efficient. It does not want dead tissue. It wants living, active catalysts. Those who are dragged into the reclamation pools are often still screaming as the acidic enzymes begin to dissolve their skin. Their nervous systems are the last things to go, intentionally preserved so that the hive mind can harvest the tactical memories and primal fears of the population. For a few horrifying moments, a man is not just himself, he is a nerve ending for a galactic predator, his entire life experience being flicked through like the pages of a discarded book before his atoms are repurposed into the chitin of a fresh warrior organism. You survive, in a sense, as part of the swarm. Your genetic material, your pain, your last frantic thoughts, they are all integrated. Somewhere in the DNA of a carnifex is the echo of a farmer's plea or a child's cry. It is a survival of the species at the absolute cost of the individual. A biological recycling program that views the soul as an inconvenient byproduct of the meat, even within the ranks of the Adeptus Astartes. The champions of our race, survival can be a gilded cage. We look upon the dreadnought with awe, seeing a walking tomb of iron and fire. But speak to the tech, marines who maintain the sarcophagi, and they will tell you of the dream, rage. A brother interred in a dreadnought does not sleep. He exists in a state of sensory deprivation so profound that the only reality is the flickering data feed of his targeting reticles. When he is not at war, he is submerged in a stasis, fluid that mimics the cold of the void. Centuries pass in what feels like a single, suffocating night. The mind begins to loop, replaying the moment of the warrior's near death over and over until the trauma becomes the only anchor for his sanity. They survive because the chapter needs their wisdom and their firepower. But the price is an existence where the only release is the heat of battle. When they are awakened, they are often disoriented, calling out the names of battle, brothers who have been dust for 1,000 years. They are relics of a lost age, kept alive by wires and stubbornness, forced to witness the slow decay of the Imperium they bled to build. To be a dreadnought is to be a ghost given a body of guns, a survivor who is never allowed to rest in the soil of his home world. In the under palaces of the nobility, there is a darker trade in survival. The youth leeches are a class of serf whose sole purpose is to act as biological filters for their masters. Through a series of bypass surgeries and alchemical grafts, the circulatory system of a high-born lord is linked to that of a dozen healthy youths. The lord's aging organs are bypassed, the strain of their excesses shunted onto the bodies of the serfs. The master remains young, vibrant, and cruel, while the leeches wither in a matter of months. Their hair falls out, their teeth crumble, and their hearts enlarge and burst under the pressure of processing 2 lives' worth of toxins. But because they are kept on a constant drip of stimulants and regenerative salts, they do not die quickly. They survive in a state of accelerated senility, their young minds trapped in bodies that are 80 years old after only a year of service. I saw a row of them once, hidden behind a velvet curtain during a gala on Scintilla. They were little more than husks, their eyes wide with the shock of a life stolen in weeks. They are the ultimate expendable survivors, kept breathing only so that a monster can continue to smile with stolen teeth. The galaxy is not a place of light, but a place of persistent shadows. These stories are not outliers. They are the fabric of our age. We have mastered the art of keeping the candle burning long after the wax has run out, indifferent to the fact that the flame is now consuming the wick and the holder alike. We are a species defined by our refusal to give up the ghost, even when the ghost is screaming to be let go. From the depth of the warp to the heights of the spires, survival is the greatest cruelty we inflict upon ourselves and others. We have built a monument to endurance out of the bones of those who simply wanted to die, and we call it the Imperium of man. The void-faring clans of the Agrippina sector tell of a phenomenon known as the ghost flux, a lingering resonance left behind when a ship's warp core bleeds its radiation into the crew's marrow over generations. I have stood on the observation decks of vessels, where the air itself felt heavy with the weight of souls who refused to depart, their biological signatures so thoroughly saturated with the warp that they had become permanent fixtures of the hull. They do not walk as spirits. They exist as semi-solid stains on the reality of the ship, their hands still reaching for lever, arms that have long since rusted into statues. This is the survival of the atmospheric, a terrifying persistence where the boundary between a person and the vessel they serve is eroded until both are one and the same. I witnessed a master, at arms on the spear of Hegera, who had been dead for 70 years according to his medical records. Yet he continued to pace the corridors of Deck 12. His body was a translucent husk of radiation, scarred tissue, his eyes glowing with a faint, baleful violet light. He did not eat, he did not sleep, and he did not speak. He simply performed his rounds, his boots making no sound on the deck plating, a silent sentinel of a duty that had transcended the threshold of the grave. The crew did not fear him, they stepped aside, for they knew that in the cold dark of the sub-sectors, such a fate was simply the ultimate promotion. They saw in him the final destiny of all who serve the Navy, a survival stripped of ego, of desire, and of the capacity to ever find rest. Beneath the surface of the death world of Catachan, there is a species of subterranean moss that the local scouts call memory, velvet. It is a parasitic organism that does not consume the flesh of its host, but rather preserves it in a state of hyper-oxygenated suspension. When a soldier falls into a crevice lined with this moss, the filaments wrap around their nervous system, feeding them a nutrient-rich sap that prevents the onset of hunger or thirst. In exchange, the moss utilizes the host's brain as a secondary processing unit to navigate the lightless tunnels. I have seen footage of a Catachan patrol that found a missing sergeant 20 years after he was declared lost. He was embedded in the wall of a cave, the moss having grown through his eye sockets and out of his mouth. He was still alive, his heart beating with a slow, rhythmic thrum that echoed the vibrations of the planet itself. When the medics tried to cut him free, he began to weep, not from pain, but because the moss was the only thing holding his fractured mind together. He had spent 2 decades experiencing the collective consciousness of the jungle, his individual identity dissolved into a sea of green. Predatory instinct. He survived the most hostile world in the galaxy by becoming part of the very thing that tried to kill him. A bargain of survival that left him a stranger to his own kind. They had to leave him there. To remove him was to kill him, and in the grim logic of the jungle, a living warning is more valuable than a dead hero. On the world of Ix, before the shadow of the plague god fell upon its gardens, there was a hospital spire dedicated to the treatment of the unbroken. These were soldiers who had survived the touch of the warp, but carried its corruption like a leaden weight in their souls. The surgeons there practiced the art of casket healing, a process where the patient is submerged in a pressurized vat of holy incense and mutagenic suppressants. The goal was survival, but the result was often a state of perpetual transition. I walked through those wards and saw men whose skin had turned to the consistency of wet clay, their features melting and reforming as the suppressants fought the warp, taint in a never-ending chemical war. They were kept alive by a constant rotation of priests and apothecaries, their prayers the only thing keeping the men from collapsing into heaps of senseless viscera. They survived because the Imperium could not afford to let the secrets they carried die with them. Every one of them was a living archive of an enemy engagement, their memories more precious than their comfort. They existed in a blur of incense smoke and surgical pain, their voices reduced to a wet gurgle as they tried to recount the horrors they had seen. Their survival was a strategic necessity, a cruel hoarding of human suffering in the name of tactical intelligence. The Inquisition, in its infinite and terrible wisdom, utilizes a process known as the penitence of the Iron Mask. This is reserved for those who have committed crimes of thought or failed in duties of extreme importance. The subject is not executed. Rather, their head is encased in a ceremonial iron helm that is fused to the collarbones. Inside the helm, a series of needles are positioned to provide constant, low-level stimulation to the pain centers of the brain, while a feeding tube delivers a slurry that keeps the body functioning at the barest level of efficiency. These masked penitents are then assigned to the most hazardous tasks, clearing radioactive slag, venturing into plague-ridden zones, or acting as human shields for inquisitorial retinues. They survive because the helm is equipped with advanced life support that can restart a stopped heart or seal a punctured lung in seconds. They are kept in a state of functional immortality until their sentence is served, which is often a period of centuries. I saw a line of them on the bridge of a black ship, their armored forms unmoving and silent. There is no sound from within the helms, only the faint hum of the machinery that ensures they cannot escape into the peace of death. They are the ultimate survivors of their own failures, forced to endure the passage of ages as a penance for a single moment of weakness. In the dark corners of the sub-sector capital worlds, there exists a cult of the eternal flesh. They are not heretics in the traditional sense, but rather a collection of the wealthy and the desperate who have found a way to bypass the limits of the human lifespan through a process of soul grafting. They find a compatible host, usually a young, unsuspecting clerk or laborer, and through a series of forbidden surgeries, they graft their own consciousness onto the host's nervous system. The original mind is not destroyed, it is pushed into a corner of the brain, a silent passenger in its own body. The graft then takes over, living a second life in a fresh, healthy frame. I investigated such a case on the world of Lorile. The victim was a young woman who had been survived by an ancient planetary governor. When we found her, she was screaming internally, her eyes reflecting a terror that her mouth, controlled by the governor, could not express. The governor spoke of his survival as a triumph of the will, a way for his genius to continue serving the throne. He did not see the girl as a person, but as a vessel, a piece of equipment to be used and discarded. To survive in this way is to become a parasite of the soul, a predator that feeds on the very future of the race to preserve a rotting past. The survival of the warp beacons is perhaps the most tragic of all. These are psykers whose power is too low to be useful for the Astronomicon, but whose presence is just strong enough to act as a localized lure for warp entities. They are placed in fortified bunkers on the edge of unstable sub-sectors, their minds amplified by psychic resonators. Their purpose is to draw the attention of roaming daemons away from populated worlds. Acting as a psychic lightning rod, they are kept alive by the most advanced medical technology the Administratum can provide. Their bodies reinforced with bionic supports to withstand the physical toll of the psychic energy flowing through them. They survive for decades. Their minds a constant battlefield as they fight off the whispers of the void. They are the ultimate sacrificial survivors, living a life of absolute isolation and mental torment so that billions of others might never know the touch of the warp. I stood outside one such bunker on the moon of Krell. The air around it felt cold and thin, and I could hear a sound like glass breaking coming from within the walls. The man inside had been there for 50 years. He was the only reason the moon remained inhabited, a single human pillar holding back a sea of madness. Finally, we must consider the survival of the remnant legions. These are units of the Astra Militarum that have been lost in warp transit for centuries, only to emerge in a different time and place. They often arrive to find their homes destroyed, their families long dead, and the Imperium they swore to protect changed beyond recognition. They are survivors of time itself, relics of a dead age who must now find a place in a universe that has forgotten them. I met a colonel from a regiment that had been missing since the age of apostasy. He looked at the modern Imperium with a mixture of horror and pity. He had survived the terrors of the warp, only to find that the world he returned to was more alien than the void. He and his men continued to fight, not out of loyalty to the current regime, but because war was the only thing that remained of their identity. They were ghosts in green fatigues, surviving on the momentum of a mission that had lost its meaning 5,000 years ago. To survive the passage of Ones is to be truly alone, a witness to the slow, agonizing death of everything you once loved. The deeper one descends into the archives of the Calixis sector, the more one encounters the fossil workers of the mining moon Sepheris Secundus. On this world, the atmospheric pressure is so immense that the human skeletal structure begins to collapse within months of arrival. To ensure the continued extraction of silicate ores, the overseers have developed a method of structural reinforcement that is a masterpiece of biological and mechanical cruelty. The miners are not given exoskeletons. Instead, high, tensile steel rods are driven directly through their long bones, and their joints are replaced with industrial, grade ball bearings. They are fused into their mining suits, their skin growing over the cold metal until they are less men and more living drills. They survive for decades in the crushing dark, their bodies incapable of sitting or lying down. They sleep standing up, locked into docking racks, while their blood is scrubbed of rock dust by external filtration units. I once saw a line of these workers during a shift change. They moved with a rhythmic, clanking gait, the sound of metal grinding on bone echoing through the tunnels like a funeral march. They do not speak, for their lungs can no longer expand enough to form words, but their eyes, wide, bloodshot, and perpetually staring, tell of a survival where the very concept of physical relief has been excised from their reality. They are the foundation of the Imperium's wealth, a layer of sentient strata that continues to breathe long after the soul has been crushed into powder. This theme of structural survival extends to the very ships that carry our armies across the void. In the lower decks of the grand cruiser Exultant Wrath, there exists a population of engine wretches who have never seen the sun, nor the stars, nor even the primary corridors of the ship. They are the descendants of a penal colony fused into the heat shielding of the plasma reactor 5 centuries ago. The radiation has warped their genetics, granting them a terrifying resilience to extreme temperatures and toxic gases. Their skin is a thick, leathery hide of scar tissue and tumors, and their nervous systems have adapted to find comfort in the bone, shaking vibration of the engines. They survive by scavenging the oily runoff of the machine, god, and hunting the multi-limbed vermin that haunt the vents. To them, the ship is not a vessel, but a god, a living mountain of iron that provides warmth and purpose. When the ship enters the warp, they are the first to feel the flicker of the Jella field, their bodies reacting with violent tremors and ecstatic visions. They are the ultimate survivors of the industrial age, a sub-species of humanity that has found a way to thrive in a hell of our own making. They do not want liberty. They fear the silence of a cold engine more than the lash of the overseer. They are the living evidence that humanity can adapt to any nightmare, provided the nightmare is consistent enough to become a home. Consider, then, the witnesses of the Golden Throne, a secretive order of scribes on holy terror, whose sole purpose is to document the psychic backlash of the Emperor's will. They reside in the shadow of the Sanctum Imperialis, in chambers where the air is ionized by the sheer proximity to the master of mankind. The psychic pressure is so intense that their physical forms begin to dissolve within days. To survive, they are encased in crystalline sarcophagi, filled with a psychically inert gel. Their minds are linked into a communal gestalt, allowing them to process the tidal waves of suffering and hope that flow through the Astronomicon. They survive for millennia, their individual identities bleeding into one another, until they are a single, weeping consciousness that records the cost of an empire's survival. I spoke with a novice who was being prepared for internment. He did not look like a man who was about to become a god. He looked like a man who was walking to his own execution. He knew that once the glass was sealed, he would never again feel the touch of the wind or the taste of bread. He would survive as a flicker of data in a sea of lightning, a silent observer of a glory that would eventually consume him entirely. His survival was a sacred duty, a way to ensure that the sacrifice of the Emperor was never forgotten, even if the cost was his own humanity. On the feral world of Mortressa, there is a phenomenon known as the Hollow Walkers. These are warriors who have been infected by a sentient, necrotizing spores that replace the soft tissues of the body with a rigid, fungal lattice. The spores do not kill the host. Instead, they act as a biological puppet master, keeping the muscles twitching and the heart beating, even when the lungs have been reduced to ash. The Hollow Walkers survive long after they should have fallen in battle, their bodies continuing to fight with a mindless, mechanical precision. I have seen a Hollow Walker continue to advance after taking a heavy bolter round to the chest, the fungal lattice simply knitting the wound shut with grey, fibrous threads. They are the ultimate soldiers, a force that cannot be broken by pain or exhaustion. But within that shell of fungus, the mind remains a tiny, flickering spark trapped in a body it no longer controls. They watch through clouded eyes as their hands commit atrocities, their silent screams muffled by the growth in their throats. They survive as passengers in their own corpses, a biological tragedy that illustrates the horrifying efficiency of a universe that views life as nothing more than a durable medium for violence. The Drukhari, in their twisted ingenuity, have perfected a device known as the glass casket of echoes. It is a form of punishment reserved for those who have shown an exceptional will to live. The victim is placed inside a coffin made of reactive glass that reflects their own thoughts back at them with 1,000-fold intensity. The casket provides just enough nourishment to keep the body from failing, while the mind is forced to relive its most shameful failures and deepest fears in a continuous, looping hallucinatory state. Because the glass reacts to the victim's own psychic signature, the torture is perfectly tailored to their specific vulnerabilities. I have seen reports of high-ranking Imperial officers who were recovered from such caskets after decades of captivity. They were physically unharmed, but their minds had been scorched into a state of permanent, wide-eyed shock. They had survived the dark city, but they had lost the ability to distinguish reality from the reflections of their own agony. They survived, but they were no longer the people who had entered the casket. They were hollow shells, filled with the echoes of a scream that would never end. In the depths of the segmentum obscurus, there is a space station known as the Anchor of Sorrows. It is a massive, drifting hospital fortress where the survivors of demon-infested worlds are taken for debriefing. The Inquisition maintains a permanent presence there, ensuring that no trace of the warp taint escapes. The survivors are kept in pressurized cells, their bodies subjected to a constant barrage of holy radiation and purifying chemicals. They survive the treatment, but at a cost that is visible in their translucent skin and the way their hair falls out in clumps. They are interrogated for years, their accounts of the horror they witnessed being cross-referenced and analyzed for any sign of heresy. They are the survivors of the ultimate nightmare, but their reward is a life of clinical, sterilized isolation. They are never allowed to leave, for the risk of contamination is too great. They spend their days staring at the gray walls of their cells. Their only contact with the outside world, the muffled voices of the interrogators. They are the poor survivors, those who have been saved from the dark only to be discarded in the light. Finally, we must look at the servants of the still clock on the forge world of Riser. These are tech adepts who have undergone a process of temporal anchoring to allow them to work on volatile plasma engines that exist in a state of fluctuating time flux. Their internal chronometers are disconnected from the standard flow of time, allowing them to perceive a single microsecond as an eternity. This allows them to perform repairs on failing reactors that would otherwise explode in the blink of an eye. However, the side effect is that they are perpetually trapped in that single microsecond. To them, the world has stopped moving. They survive in a frozen landscape of fire and metal, their only company the silent, unmoving forms of their fellow adepts. They spend what feels like centuries walking across a bridge of solidified flame, their minds slowly unraveling in the infinite silence of a moment that never ends. They survive because the Imperium needs their expertise, but they pay for it with an existence that is a literal living hell of stagnation. They are the guardians of the Emperor's light, trapped forever in the shadow of a single, ticking clock. The final ledger of human endurance is not written in the halls of victory, but in the silent, pressurized deeps of the halo stars, where the light of the Astronomicon is a guttering candle against an infinite, hungry tide. Here, I have encountered the sleepless of the outer dark, a caste of void, watchers who serve upon sensor stations drifting on the very edge of the galactic rim, to ensure they never falter in their vigil. Their eyelids are surgically removed and their lacrimal glands replaced with an automated irrigation system that cycles holy oils across the surface of the eye. They are chemically barred from the state of sleep, their brains kept in a permanent, alert waking dream through the injection of neuro-stimulants that would liquefy a normal man's heart in an hour. They survive for decades in the absolute silence of the void, staring into the black for the faint. Telltale distortion of a Necron tomb, ship or the shadow of a Terranid hive fleet. I spoke to one who had been at his post for 80 standard years. He did not recognize the concept of a home or a name. He was merely an extension of the cogitator, his consciousness a thin wire stretched across the abyss. He told me that the stars do not twinkle out there, they watch, and they wait for the light of man to fail. He survived not out of a will to live, but because the biological momentum of his augmentations refused to let him stop. He was a ghost whose body had forgotten how to die, a sentinel of a race that is too terrified to close its eyes even for a second. This refusal to relinquish the spark of life finds its most grotesque expression in the trophy gardens of the heretic lords within the Eye of Terror. But we need not look to the great enemy to find such horrors. Within the sub-levels of our own inquisitorial fortresses, there exists the labyrinth of the living records. Here, witnesses of forbidden events are kept in a state of suspended animation that is anything but peaceful. Their nervous systems are woven into the very architecture of the facility, their memories acting as a living library. When an inquisitor requires information on a specific heretic or a lost relic, they access the witness. The process involves a massive surge of psychic energy that forces the witness to relive the trauma of their experience in vivid, agonizing detail so that the data can be harvested. These survivors are hundreds of years old, their bodies withered to the point of transparency, yet they are kept alive by the constant flow of nutrient, slurry, and the cold, unfeeling care of the machine, spirits. They are the ultimate survivors of their own history, unable to forget and unable to depart. Their existence a testament to the fact that in the Imperium, even your own memories are not your own. They are assets to be hoarded and exploited until the end of time. I remember a specific record from the hive world of Armageddon, concerning a group of miners trapped in a collapsed shaft during the Second War. They were not reached by the orcs, nor by the relief teams, for 3 years. When the shaft was finally reopened, the recovery teams found a society of survivors that had regressed into something fundamentally unhuman. They had survived by eating the toxic moss that grew on the cooling pipes of the geothermal processors, a substance that had mutated their vocal cords into high-pitched whistles and turned their skin into a translucent, sightless membrane. They had developed a communal language based on the vibrations of the pipes, a rhythmic tapping that allowed them to coordinate their movements in the absolute dark. They were survivors, yes, but they were no longer part of the human race. They were a new branch of evolution born from necessity and filth. When they were brought to the surface, the light of the sun blinded them instantly, their delicate nervous systems collapsing under the sensory overload of a world that was too bright, too loud, and too large. They died within minutes of their rescue, their survival having been a localized adaptation to a hell that was the only world they understood. It was a mercy, though the administratum clerks merely marked it as a loss of potential labor. The Chronos gladiators of the underworld fighting pits provide another window into the cruelty of endurance. These warriors are fitted with death clocks implanted in their spines, vials of lethal toxins that will trigger if their heart rate drops below a certain threshold or if they fail to kill an opponent within a set time frame. To stay alive, they must exist in a state of perpetual, hyper-adrenalized violence. They are survivors of the arena, men and women who have been turned into sharks that must keep swimming through blood or drown in their own chemistry. I saw one such gladiator who had survived for 12 years. His body was a map of scars and bionic replacements, his eyes wide and frantic, darting from side to side even when there was no enemy in sight. He had forgotten how to be still. He had survived by becoming a personification of the very war that defines our galaxy, a creature of pure, unthinking aggression that survives only because the alternative is an immediate, chemical execution. He was a survivor of the most base sort, a man who had traded his soul for one more minute of frantic, gasping life. Even the holy Mechanicus are not immune to the horror of excessive survival. On the forge world of Gaia, there is a class of adept known as the data leeches. Their biological brains have been entirely replaced by organic, synthetic sponges that can hold petabytes of information, but they lack the capacity for independent thought. They are kept in stasis libraries, their bodies floating in vats of coolant, their minds serving as backups for the forge world's primary logic engines. They are alive in the sense that their cells are respiring and their neurons are firing, but they have no ego, no memory of being human, no sense of self. They are survivors of a process that viewed the human mind as a cluttered hard drive that needed to be wiped clean. They survive because their capacity for storage is higher than any silicon-based alternative, a biological resource that is harvested and overwritten as the needs of the omniscient dictate. They are the silent, breathing archives of our technological heritage, a survival of the hardware at the total expense of the software. We must also acknowledge the famine walkers of the dead worlds, those who survive in the wake of a tyrannid consumption or an exterminatus. They are the ghosts of a world that has been stripped of its biosphere, living in the ruins of cities where the air is thin and the water is poison. They survive by scavenging the remnants of industrial chemicals and eating the dust of their own ancestors. I have seen images of these survivors from the world of Tyran. They were like walking skeletons, their skin stretched tight over bones that had become brittle as glass. They did not cry, for they had no moisture to spare for tears. They simply walked, a slow, shuffling procession through a grey landscape of ash and silence. They were survivors of a global extinction, the last flickering embers of a fire that had already gone out. They had no hope of rescue, no future to build, and no legacy to leave. They survived simply because the instinct to breathe is the hardest one to break, even when there is nothing left to breathe for. In the end, we must ask ourselves what it means to survive in a universe that is fundamentally hostile to the human spirit. Is the dreadnought a survivor, or is he a prisoner? Is the servitor a survivor, or is he a tool? Is the citizen of the Imperium a survivor, or is he a victim of a system that views his suffering as a necessary fuel? I have looked into the eyes of the awake servants, the masked penitents, and the witnesses of the Golden Throne, and I have seen the same thing in all of them, a profound, weary exhaustion. They are tired of the light, tired of the dark, and tired of the endless, grinding machinery of their own existence. They survive because we force them to, because the Imperium is a monument to the idea that life is a duty, not a right. We have built a civilization that can keep a heart beating in a jar for 1,000 years, but we have forgotten how to give that heart a reason to beat. We are a race of survivors in a galaxy of graves, clinging to the edge of the void with bloody fingernails, terrified of the fall, but even more terrified of the endurance. This is the darkest survival, to realize that death is the only thing we have left to look forward to, and even that is a luxury we may never be granted. My vigil continues, my eyes forever open, my pen forever moving, recording the cost of a survival that has become its own damnation.